Legends and Luminaries. I'm Julie, and today we're talking true crime at Booksmart. It's the story of Casey Anthony with two books, Imperfect Justice, Prosecuting Casey Anthony by Jeff Ashton, and Inside the Mind of Casey Anthony, a psychological portrait by Keith Ablow, MD. I found both of these books at my used bookstores on two separate occasions. I found Inside the Mind of Casey Anthony when I was almost done reading Imperfect Justice, and then Hulu had a couple of documentaries on her. The universe was throwing Casey Anthony at me, so I thought I'd bite. I remember the general details of Casey Anthony. Her 3-year-old daughter, Kaylee, is missing and is not reported for 31 days. Casey Anthony is a pathological liar. Her parents are highly dysfunctional, and the whole family is beyond messed up. Kaylee is found months later in a garbage bag, decomposed, just a hop, skip, and a jump from the Anthony home. Casey is arrested, charged, and found not guilty. That's the case in a nutshell, although there's a lot of soap opera details. Let me start with Jeff Ashton's book, Imperfect Justice. I love reading lawyers' books on cases, partly because after watching LA Law when I was in junior high, I thought about becoming a lawyer. I like these books because you learn about details that never made it to court, details the press knew nothing about, and the creative process in developing a narrative to tell the jury. Perhaps I'm being a bit harsh when I say this, but I can partly see why Ashton lost the case. It was a dry book, repetitive, and their motive was weak, not to mention that the jury didn't even charge Casey Anthony with any sort of aggravated child abuse. Ouch. Imperfect Justice reveals the primary problems with our judicial system, all those behind-the-scenes details that we don't always think about as we watch a trial unfold. This is the only interesting part of the book. I didn't enjoy Ashton's style of writing. Despite the fascinating characters in the case, and they are characters that an author could only hope to dream up, I was not glued to the book. It was bland at times and repetitive. It's kind of a first this happened, and then we did this. It's just tedious at times and not an interesting tediousness. I also thought Ashton was forcing a narrative that didn't make sense. I didn't mind his opinionated tone, as he is a lawyer and in some ways still trying the case to prove his point. I'm going to focus on 3 areas where Ashton went wrong with the case and in his storytelling, that the story he was building didn't fit all together. Number 1, they never considered George a suspect. George is Casey's father. Casey and Kaylee live at home with her parents. Cindy, the mom, is immediately labeled controlling. When George talks to the police and then the prosecutors, they appear to feel some sympathy for him, like poor George has to put up with overbearing, controlling, mean shrew that is his wife, Cindy. George used to be a cop, so already he's given kind of a free pass in the investigation, like he's on the cop's side, but he really has no answers about his daughter's behavior and contributes nothing of value. A lot of what he tells the police doesn't even make sense. Other than Casey, George was the last person to see Kaylee alive. Yet no one considers that alarming in any way, shape, or form. When we find out that someone did an internet search about how to make chloroform, Cindy tries to say she was the one who did it, yet the cell phone records indicate she was not at home at the time to do so. No one looks at George's cell phone records and his locations at the time of such a search, nor that last day when Kaylee was seen alive. In one of the documentaries I watched, I learned that after the trial and after both these books, they uncovered a second search regarding suffocation. The reason George is such a big factor here is because Casey accuses him of being a part of the crime. She also accuses him of sexual abuse. Since the police did a less than thorough job on investigating George, there is at least some reasonable doubt regarding his involvement. Plus, when you dig into the craziness of the participants' behaviors long before Kaylee disappeared, and then after she disappeared, and then during the trial, well, the cops just didn't look at all the options and gathered all the evidence they maybe should have. Not to mention the police ignored the calls made by a lineman who found Kaylee's remains. It took him 3 phone calls for anyone to look into it, but that's another story. But of course, Ashton doesn't admit to any of this, only that the jury was made up of idiots who never watched the news because those were the only people who could fill a jury pool. Number 2. Their motive is weak. The prosecution claims that the reason Casey killed her daughter was because she wanted to live child-free. She wanted to party and sleep around and did not want any responsibility whatsoever as a parent. They obsess over a tattoo Casey gets shortly after Kaylee disappears that says Bella Vita, meaning beautiful life. Casey Anthony didn't work, although she told everyone she had at least 2 jobs. She stole money from everyone. She brought Kaylee with her to one apartment and another and spent the night wherever. So Kaylee obviously wasn't holding Casey back from partying. The prosecution makes a huge deal out of slutty party photos taken when Kaylee was gone. Yet they never dig into the family situation all that much. It's beyond dysfunctional, yet they seem to place little significance on it. That would explain Casey's behavior more than anything. She rarely went home during those 31 days. And yet George and Cindy aren't the least bit alarmed that they haven't seen their granddaughter in a month. Prior to that, they never went more than one night without her. No one seems to consider the family dynamic very crucial to how things happened. Ashton appears to stand by his motive, never even contemplating that perhaps now, after the fact, that the family dynamic would explain more of Casey's behavior. And number 3, the prosecution didn't put Casey's negligence as a mother during those 31 days in the spotlight. They focused on her partying and her slutty dresses, but they didn't force any sort of child neglect or even aggravated manslaughter of a child or aggravated child abuse. They wanted the first-degree murder charge, and that's what they focused on. One of the documentaries I watched interviewed the judge in the case, and he had some great insight. The judge said the prosecution focused too much on the murder that could result in the death penalty. They failed to address Casey Anthony's parental neglect over their 31 days, which would have received some prison sentence, but the jury found her not guilty on all counts except the charge of providing false information to police. The judge was like it was either all or nothing. Ashton has little reflection on this matter either, just repeating that the jury was made up of idiots. Dr. Keith Ablow's book, Inside the Mind of Casey Anthony, was not much better of a book. Ablow could have condensed this book into a 20-page article and been done with it. As a typical psychologist, he says everything is Cindy's fault. She's controlling and everything revolves around her. Kaylee was nothing more than a prop in their lives. George was in the delivery room and at the foot of the bed as Kaylee was born, so he saw his daughter's vagina, something that Ablow repeats at least 30 times in the book. I lost count somewhere in the 20s, and that was only after he had already mentioned it countless times. The nurse hands the newborn to Cindy first, not to Casey. Ablow obsesses over the long-lasting effects of what happened in the delivery room. You will learn some other messed up details about the Anthony family, but I don't know if all the neighbors and friends of the family are reliable sources. Ablow does point out some things that Ashton and other investigators just glossed over, like Casey's dizzying romantic timeline, as Ablow entitles a chapter. Casey's juggling multiple guys at once. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but Casey is definitely addicted to attention and needing constant contact with someone. The best part of Ablow's book is toward the end. Much of the book rehashes the same interview transcripts that Ashton included as well, and that were also shown on the documentaries. So I skipped many of them, which I usually don't do that. But what Ablow analyzes is really how little Casey tells the detectives. They're the ones that are doing all the talking, hypothesizing scenarios about what happened to Kaylee, and most of Casey's responses are, okay, no, yeah, and I don't know. Even when they catch her red-handed in a lie, they still get nothing out of her. Let me read you this, because Ablow is kind of hilarious in how he interprets the inability of the cops to get anything out of her. The amazing thing is that none of Casey Anthony's intellectual tug-of-war with 3 detectives who had talked vicious gang members into confessions probably required any conscious thought on her part at all. Her hyperbolic ability to deny reality had been honed over decades and was triggered automatically by anyone who sought to pierce her armor or cause her any strife. Being evasive wasn't an effort. It was like running water downhill, like a helium balloon floating away. It felt natural to her now after all the years she had spent trying not to feel. She had admitted to nothing other than lying about the truth about lying about the truth about lying, or something like that. It really didn't matter. That was the point. And even if the cops and company had not had enough, I'd have saved them from themselves. They may have suffered lasting head trauma from staying in that room with Casey Anthony too long. It's just hilarious, and it doesn't look good for the detectives in the case either. Ablow also gives us more updates on the family, like George and Cindy sold Kaylee's photographs for money and were paid up to $1 million to go on Dr. Phil. Ablow's book complements Ashton's book nicely, providing a contrast and comic relief to a very tragic case that was a bit bungled from the start. So ultimately, did Casey Anthony kill her daughter? I think she did. Even if George is a pedophile, I don't think he killed Kaylee. I was leaning against premeditation, but after finding out that foolproof suffocation was researched on Anthony's home computer, I do think Kaylee's death was not an accident. Casey Anthony wove her tale of George and Kaylee in the pool, probably because the detectives even suggested that Kaylee could have drowned in the pool. But I'm sure there are many more internet sleuths out there that have a lot more information on the Casey Anthony case than I ever could. If you are into true crime, I don't know if either of these books are really a great read. However, if you are into the Casey Anthony case, then these books should be part of your research. Neither are particularly insightful or engaging, but they both will provide a more in-depth look at what went wrong and how a jury didn't even think to find Casey Anthony guilty of something. That those 31 days of Casey not even reporting her daughter missing was worth any sort of charge. That's probably the part of the case that I find most shocking. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.